Menendez is 18 years old. So they are very young adults trying to stretch out and make it into the world at this point in time. But as we know now, there has been a lifetime of A. So it's been a struggle. So Lyle and his brother Eric told investigators that they had arrived home to find their parents the way that they were. However, we now know that it was them. At the time of his life ending, Jose Menendez was working for a film studio running its home video division. Investigators initially suspected that that their lives ending may have been tied to his business dealings. But attention soon shifted to the couple's sons, Lyle and Eric, because their behaviors were strange after their parents were gone. So in the wake of the crime, the brothers appeared to be spending their parents' money, and lots of it. They purchased Rolex watches and real estate and invested in businesses. But I do want to say that they were used to this lavish life, this lavish lifestyle. So I don't know if they were doing anything differently than they would have been doing had their parents still been alive. I think it might have just been something that the media glommed onto, like, oh, look at this, they're living this rich and famous life and they're buying Rolexes and fancy cars and all this stuff. So I think the media really blew that up because they were just used to that lifestyle. All right, so a tip leads to arrests. While the brothers' behavior in the wake of the crime may have seemed unusual, it wasn't hard evidence. But then, about 6 months after the crime, in March 1990, police got a tip from an unlikely source. Judalyn Smith, the girlfriend of a psychologist who Lyle and Eric Menendez had been talking to, she told police that the brothers had confessed to ending their parents' lives in therapy, and there was an audio taped recording of it. All right, so days later, on March 8th, 1990, Lyle Menendez was arrested by Beverly Hills police outside the mansion where his parents' lives were ended. 2 days after that, Eric Menendez surrendered at Los Angeles International Airport upon returning from Israel, where he had been playing tennis. So then that kind of leads us to where we are now. We're going to go through the opening statements shortly. So I don't want to get it more into the rest of this article just because it takes us all the way through to the mistrial and all that. So we can come back to this article later. I want to get to the opening statements. So let me switch my views here. Sorry. Why is that not? You know what? Here we go. Sorry. There we go. All right. I do have this. People gave me so much hate for speeding up the video. I do want to speed it up to 1.25 just so it's a little faster because especially court proceedings can go slowly. If it's too fast, let me know. I can slow it down. But in other videos where I speed it up, people have given me some angry, hateful things there. So let's just, if you can follow along, let me know. If not, I can change it. So here we go.
Be discussing a few things with you before we get started. First of all, let me tell you a little bit about today's proceedings, and then we'll get right into them. When you were seated here, I know there was a little uncertainty as to where you're supposed to be seated because many of you recall your positions in the courtroom. And
I want to pause it there 1 second. I forgot to mention that they have two separate trials going on concurrently. So instead of trying them together with one jury, they each have their own jury in the same room, and they're watching the same thing happening and unfolding. So both brothers have their own trial happening, but it's happening at the same time, if that makes sense. So I hope it's not too confusing.
The seventh floor during jury selection, so I know there's a little confusion, but I think you'll settle in and become acquainted with the surroundings here. And what is going to happen today is that you will be hearing the opening statements in the case of People versus Joseph Lyle Menendez. And as I've indicated to you before, and I'll remind you now and throughout the trial, your concern is to decide the case of People versus Joseph Lyle Menendez, and only that case. There will be another jury that will be in court that will deal with the case of the co-defendant, Eric Galen Menendez. He is in court today, and you have not seen him before in these proceedings. He is the gentleman. I'll ask you to stand, Mr. Menendez. This is Eric Galen Menendez. He is the co-defendant. Thank you, sir. And the other jury will be the jury that decides his case. Your job, as I've indicated, is to decide the case of Joseph Lyle Menendez. And other people at council table whom you've not met before are Eric Menendez's lawyers, and I'll introduce you to them. First of all, Ms. Leslie Abramson and Ms. Marcia Morrissey. The other jury is not present yet today. They will be here later, and they will be hearing the opening statement in regards to the case of Eric Menendez. And when both juries are in the courtroom, as I've indicated to you before, one jury will be in the jury box, the other jury will be in the middle section of the courtroom here. At this point, the middle section is being occupied by the public. During the trial, we'll have, for times when both juries are in the courtroom, and that'll be most of the trial, the center section will be occupied by jurors. And periodically during the trial, I'll move you from the jury box into the audience and switch you back and forth, probably on a weekly basis, just so that each jury has equal opportunity to have the jury box.
I'm going to skip through to the prosecution's statement here. I want to find her.
Apparatus in the courtroom, and no, it's a good idea. No, you can't do that. It's a good idea, but yeah, but we can't do that. Good try. It might very well be in time that will be something that we could do, but right now we can't do that. We have to rely upon your own note-taking if you want to take the word that's being said.
I'm going to repeat exactly what the judge just told you because it's an important legal concept. What I'm going to outline here in the next 20 minutes to half an hour is an overview of what the people anticipate the evidence will show. But what I'm going to tell you is not evidence. It's merely an aid so that when you hear the evidence as we present it, you have some sort of context into which to place it so it doesn't come to you in a vacuum. And this is what the people believe the evidence will show. On August the 20th of 1989, at approximately 11:47 p.m., Beverly Hills Police Dispatcher Christina Nye received a 911 call at the police station. On the line was Lyle Menendez, who sounded hysterical, reporting that, quote, someone shot my mom and my dad, end quote. You will hear that 911 tape, and you will hear the emotion manifested in that phone call. Police officers from the Beverly Hills Police Department arrived at the scene, 722 North Elm Drive, in under 5 minutes. Police Officer Michael Butkus and Sergeant Kurt West, both of the Beverly Hills Police Department, will testify in this case. Officer Butkus arrived at the scene first. He approached the house, and shortly thereafter, he heard screaming as the two defendants, Eric Menendez and Lyle Menendez, came running out the front door. Officer Butkus will describe the demeanor of the defendants that night in their first contact with the police. Sergeant West was one of the last units to arrive at the scene in response to the initial radio dispatch. Sergeant West and other officers entered the house to determine what had happened and to determine if the killers were still inside of the house. Sergeant West will describe his discovery of the bodies of Jose Enrique Menendez and Mary Louise Menendez inside of the family room of the Menendez home that night. Sergeant West determined that both victims were dead, and he also noticed that pellet patterns he observed in the room indicated to him that a shotgun had been used in the killings. Sergeant West is familiar with shotguns, and he did not notice any visual signs of shotgun smoke, nor did he smell any shotgun smoke in the room. Neither did he see any signs of expended shotgun shells. He also noticed that both the television set and the lights were on inside of that room where the bodies were found. The police proceeded through the house, and Sergeant West noticed that there were 2 rifles inside a closet in a bedroom upstairs. Sergeant West also searched a guest house in the back of the Menendez property. The lights were on inside of the guest house, and its front door was open. No other weapons were noticed or recovered at the crime scene that night, aside from the 2 rifles seen in the upstairs closet by Sergeant West. Both of the defendants were taken to the police station to be interviewed. The house was now off limits while the police and coroner's personnel began the grim task of examining the Menendez home and its contents. At 1:42 a.m., 2 hours after the 911 call, Sergeant Thomas Edmonds, also of the Beverly Hills Police Department, spoke with Lyle Menendez to find out what he knew about the events of that evening and who might have committed this crime. Lyle Menendez told Sergeant Edmonds that he and his brother had gone to the movies that night at Century Plaza, and then had gone to the Santa Monica Civic Center to attend a food and wine tasting function. Lyle Menendez told Sergeant Edmonds that he was supposed to meet a friend of his by the name of Perry Berman at the Santa Monica Civic Center. Lyle Menendez told Sergeant Edmonds that he and his brother had missed Mr. Berman at the Santa Monica Civic Center, and so Lyle Menendez called Mr. Berman from a payphone at the Civic Center. Lyle Menendez used a U.S. Sprint calling card registered to his father, Jose Menendez, and the records of that transaction show 2 phone calls made to Perry Berman from a payphone at the Santa Monica Civic at 11:07 and 11:15 p.m. Lyle Menendez went on to tell Sergeant Edmonds that during these 2 telephone calls, he arranged to meet Perry Berman at a restaurant in Beverly Hills instead that night. Lyle Menendez continued and told Sergeant Edmonds that he and his brother returned home to pick up some sort of identification for Eric Menendez, which would enable him to enter a bar should they and Perry Berman decide to go for drinks. Lyle Menendez told Sergeant Edmonds that the defendants entered the house, found their parents, and called the police. Lyle Menendez specifically mentioned the smell of smoke in reference to entering the room where his parents' bodies were found. Contrast this with the statement of Sergeant West that when he entered the family room, he neither saw nor smelled smoke. Sergeant Edmonds asked Lyle Menendez if he had any idea as to who would have done this crime. Lyle Menendez opined that his father would probably be the reason for the murders, that it would have been business-related, and that some of the people affiliated with his father's business were seedy. Lyle Menendez also told Sergeant Edmonds that he knew that there were 2 rifles inside of the house and that his mother had just purchased one of them. Lyle Menendez went on to say that he called the police shortly after discovering his parents' bodies and that the police came pretty quickly. In describing the crime scene, Lyle Menendez told Sergeant Edmonds the following. It doesn't seem like they heard anything because they were on the couch, and my dad is usually pretty deaf to hear something, so when he gets up right away, and he continued on, so I was really surprised that he was sitting on the couch like that. My mother was on the floor, like she was trying to get away or something. Sergeant Edmonds next spoke to Eric Menendez during those early morning hours. Eric Menendez too told Sergeant Edmonds that he and his brother had gone to the movies that night and had gotten lost going to Santa Monica to see Perry Berman. A neighbor of the Menendezes who lives 2 doors south of their home will testify that she heard popping noises that night at around 10 p.m., almost 2 hours before the 911 call made by Lyle Menendez. This neighbor thought the noises were made by firecrackers, and so she dissuaded her son from calling the police. When detectives arrived at the crime scene, they too saw the bodies discovered by Sergeant West. The detectives also saw that there were no expended shotgun shells in the room where the murders had occurred. Perry Berman will be a witness in this case. He is the young man who was to meet the Menendez brothers at the Santa Monica Civic Center. He will tell you that on the afternoon before the killings, that is, the afternoon of August the 20th, he arrived home to find a message on his answering machine from Lyle Menendez. When he finally reached Lyle Menendez by phone, Lyle Menendez wanted to see him that night. Perry Berman had already made plans to go to the food and wine tasting event in Santa Monica, but he invited Lyle Menendez to join Perry and a friend of his with whom he had already made plans. Perry Berman will tell you that he did not see Lyle Menendez in Santa Monica, and he went home to bed. Around 11 o'clock that night, Mr. Berman received a telephone call from Lyle Menendez, who urged him to meet with the Menendez brothers at their parents' home in Beverly Hills, whereupon they would go somewhere else to eat. Not wanting to disturb the Menendez parents, Perry Berman agreed to meet Lyle Menendez at the Cheesecake Factory in Beverly Hills, which is a restaurant. Mr. Berman dressed, went to the Cheesecake Factory, and waited for a half hour for the defendants to arrive. While there, the night silence was broken by the sound of sirens, and after concluding that the brothers were not going to show up, Mr. Berman went towards the Menendez home. When he got there, he saw the police, whose sirens he had heard while waiting at the restaurant. Forensic criminalists from the Sheriff's Department will testify.
I just want to pause it there and say I find it kind of strange. To me, it means that these boys didn't do they didn't pre-plan this. It wasn't premeditated. It was just, off the cuff type of thing. They were thinking about it because they had made plans with this Berman guy and they were supposed to have left the house, but instead they went and did this. So it makes me, you don't make plans if you're about to go do something like that, especially in creating more doubt as to, or not doubt, but, solidifying more that your guilt because you didn't show somewhere where you said you were going to be. So it doesn't make sense that they thought this out or that it was premeditated. I feel like it was someone just snapped at the moment. Like maybe something was said or done by the parents and one of them just couldn't take it anymore, and both brothers were in.
About some of the conclusions which can and cannot be made from looking at the photographs of the crime scene in this case. A doctor from the coroner's office who performed the autopsies on Mr. and Mrs. Menendez will describe the wounds which ended the lives of these victims. The coroner's representative will tell you that Mr. Menendez had 5 shotgun wounds, the major one being an entrance wound to the back of Mr. Menendez's head. He will also tell you that Mrs. Menendez had 10 separate shotgun wounds, some of which could have been caused by the same blast. An expert on firearms will testify as to the workings of a shotgun, shotgun pellet patterns, and other things specific to this crime scene. The head of the Sheriff's Serology Department will tell you that Jose Menendez was not killed precisely in the position in which you will see him in the photographs, due to the pooling of blood on the family sofa. He will also tell you what can and cannot be said about this crime scene. Shortly after the killings, Lyle Menendez began to spend money, a lot of money. On Thursday, August the 24th, he, in the company of his brother, purchased 3 Rolex watches and some money clips. On September the 8th of 1989, 19 days after the killings, a life insurance policy which had been procured earlier by Jose Menendez was paid to the defendants. The policy cumulatively was for $650,000, and over a period of a week between September the 8th and September the 15th, $325,000 was paid out to each defendant. Lyle Menendez returned to the Princeton, New Jersey area after a memorial service for his parents, which was held in Los Angeles on August the 25th of 1989. Lyle Menendez had been a student at Princeton University in the spring of 1989, and the family had lived in the township of Princeton before moving to California earlier. During the initial few days of his stay in Princeton, Lyle Menendez hired bodyguards to guard him. Lyle Menendez and his bodyguards traveled around Princeton in limousines during this period. Richard Wenskowski was hired as one of those bodyguards. He will testify in this case, and Mr. Wenskowski will tell you that one day he accompanied Lyle Menendez to the airport so that Lyle Menendez could make a quick trip from the East Coast to the West Coast. You will learn from other evidence that once in Los Angeles, Lyle Menendez hired a computer expert named Howard Witkin to access the Menendez family's home computer. Lyle Menendez had Howard Witkin, the computer expert, look through the family's computer menu for 4 different headings. Those headings were entitled Eric, Will, Lyle, and Menendez. Mr. Witkin found files with 3 of these headings, but there was no information of any use in those computer files. Lyle Menendez asked Mr. Witkin to erase the entire computer so that he could sell the computer. Mr. Witkin did so and was paid with a check drawn on the account of Jose Menendez for $150. The computer was erased by Mr. Witkin on August the 31st, 1989, 11 days after the deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Menendez. Mr. Wenskowski will also tell you that he had a conversation with Lyle Menendez, during which Lyle Menendez asked him if ballistics evidence could be used to trace an expended shotgun shell to a particular weapon. Mr. Wenskowski told him no. After erasing the computer, Lyle Menendez returned to Princeton the same day. Sometime after the computer's erasure, Lyle Menendez had a conversation with his best friend, Glenn Stevens. Mr. Stevens was a student at Princeton University in the fall of 1989 and had been enrolled with Lyle Menendez during the spring semester of 1989, some several months before. Lyle Menendez told his best friend, Glenn Stevens, after the killings, that Lyle's uncle Carlos had found something in the family computer which was under one of 3 headings. Lyle Menendez told Glenn Stevens that Lyle Menendez's father had been upset with him and that if there was a new will in the computer, he, Lyle, might not be in it. Lyle Menendez told him that the will that the family was aware of, that is the other relatives in the family, had left everything to Lyle Menendez and his brother. Lyle Menendez told Mr. Stevens that the person he had hired to erase the computer was some little Jewish guy, that no one would ever be able to find him. On December the 5th of 1989, several months now after the murders, the police found Mr. Witkin. They served a search warrant at 722 North Elm Drive and recovered the family's computer. Alongside the computer was a receipt for services rendered dated August the 31st, 1989, and this receipt led the police to the discovery of Mr. Witkin. On September the 17th, now going backwards, but September the 17th, less than a month after the killings, Beverly Hills police detectives interviewed Lyle Menendez at the home of one of his relatives in New Jersey. The conversation dealt with various habits of the victims, with the activities of the Menendez family the weekend of the killings, possible motives for the killings, and the activities of the defendants on the evening of the killing. Lyle Menendez told the police that the night before the killings, which would have been Saturday, August the 19th, the Menendez family had gone night fishing and had gotten home about 12:30 a.m. early on Sunday morning. He told the police that he and his brother went to the movies the night of the killings, that he and his brother went to see License to Kill, but that it was sold out, and so they saw Batman instead, and it was a movie they had both seen previously. After the movie, Lyle Menendez and his brother, in his brother's car and with his brother driving, had gone to Santa Monica to meet Perry Berman, and they had gotten lost along the way. Lyle Menendez explained to the detectives that he hadn't seen Mr. Berman in 3 weeks prior to the killings, that he had a lot of things going on that he wanted to talk to Mr. Berman about, and that, quote, I had to go see him, unquote. He also acknowledged that Perry Berman worked on Monday, that he'd called him at about 11 or 11:15 to meet at the Cheesecake Factory, and Lyle acknowledged that this was his idea. He explained that he and his brother went back to the house to get phony ID so that his brother could go drink if necessary, which is when they found their parents. Lyle Menendez again mentioned the smoke to the detectives on September the 17th. He mentioned the smoke that he saw in the room upon the discovery of his parents' bodies. He said the police were called right away and arrived right away. Lyle Menendez was asked by the detectives about his parents' sleeping habits, particularly about whether they would fall asleep while watching television. Lyle Menendez told the detectives that his father would fall asleep in a movie just like that, but that his mother had insomnia, so whether or not she would fall asleep was a matter of how tired she was. He also said that his father was not easily awakened, but that his mother awoke easily. Lyle Menendez also told the police that the maid had Saturdays and Sunday nights off. In another portion of the discussion, Lyle Menendez was comforted by the detectives that both of his parents had not suffered and had died instantaneously. Lyle Menendez and the detectives discussed possible motives for the killings, and the subject turned to Jose Menendez's business dealings. Lyle Menendez told the police that his father had received threats from people. He discussed the possibility that his parents' deaths were linked to organized crime, and also discussed his own needs for a bodyguard because he was being followed. Lyle Menendez made the statement that, quote, it's pretty difficult to get good security, unquote. But from what we now know, this hint that his own life might have been in danger because of his parents' killings was a lie. In response to the police questions about any problems that Lyle might have had with his parents, Lyle Menendez told the police that he and his mother had recently quarreled over the fact that he had locked himself out of the family home and he had to wake his mother to get inside, a fairly trivial incident. He said that he had no other problems with his parents. While the police were there questioning Lyle Menendez, they noticed that he was wearing a gold Rolex watch, and he confirmed that he had purchased it shortly before his parents' memorial service, which the evidence will show was on August the 25th. He also indicated that he had charged the Rolex watch on his father's credit card. By March of 1990, 6.5 months after the killings, the police were getting ready to make arrests for the murders of Jose and Mary Louise Menendez. Around this time, Glenn Stevens, Lyle's best friend from Princeton, flew from Princeton to Los Angeles with Lyle Menendez and another Princeton student named Hayden Rogers. Once in Los Angeles, Lyle Menendez told Glenn Stevens that he, Lyle, had called back east to the East Coast and had discovered that the Beverly Hills police detectives had been there recently. Glenn Stevens will describe Lyle as being made nervous by this. At this time, Lyle took approximately $2,000 out of his pocket and divided it between Glenn Stevens and Mr. Rogers. Lyle Menendez told Glenn Stevens that, should anything happen to him, Mr. Stevens should contact Lyle Menendez's attorney. Lyle Menendez also told Mr. Stevens that there were only two people who knew everything, his attorney and a man named Dr. Oziel. Lyle Menendez explained to Glenn Stevens that Dr. Oziel had some cassette tapes in a safety deposit box, and that if the police ever got their hands on those tapes, he, Lyle Menendez, would be, and I apologize, fucked. On March the 8th of 1990, the police executed a search warrant at the home of Dr. Oziel. The police searched a safety deposit box belonging to Dr. Oziel and obtained a cassette tape which contained Dr. Oziel's verbal notes of 2 psychological sessions he had had with both Eric and Lyle Menendez. Lyle Menendez was arrested the same day by the Beverly Hills Police Department for the murders of his parents. Lyle Menendez's prediction to Glenn Stevens as to what would happen to him if the police got their hands on the Oziel tape had come true. The shotguns used in the murders were never recovered. After searching Dr. Oziel's safety deposit box, the police were led to the San Diego area in search of records which would show the purchase of shotguns. After visiting several stores, the police went to a Big 5 sporting goods store. In searching the records, they discovered firearms purchase records in the name of a man named Donovan Goodrow. Early on in the investigation, in September, the police had traveled back east to interview family and friends of the victims and the defendants. During this visit, the police confirmed that Lyle Menendez had a friend named Donovan Goudreau, who lived on the East Coast. When the police saw Donovan Goudreau's name on the purchase records for 2 shotguns in San Diego, which were purchased 2 days before the killings on August the 18th, 1989, the police knew that they had hit pay dirt. Donovan Goudreau will tell you that on August the 18th, 1989, 2 days before the Menendez killings, he was not in San Diego buying 2 shotguns, but instead was working in a restaurant in the city of New York. Mr. Goudreau will also tell you that he had been a roommate of Lyle Menendez's in the spring of 1989 at Princeton University, although he himself was not a student at Princeton University. Lyle Menendez kicked Mr. Goudreau out of his room. He no longer wished Mr. Goudreau to be his roommate. And in approximately May of 1989, Mr. Goudreau left for New York City. Mr. Goudreau will also tell you that he discovered that his wallet and identification were missing when he traveled to New York. Glenn Stevens will tell you that Lyle Menendez bragged to Glenn Stevens that he had stolen Mr. Goudreau's wallet in order to get back at Mr. Goudreau because Lyle Menendez suspected that Donovan Goudreau had stolen money from Lyle Menendez. Lyle Menendez also indicated that he would forge Mr. Goudreau's signature to obtain this retribution. Amanda Adams Greer was working at the Big Five sporting goods store on August the 18th. She will explain to you the various forms that were filled out to complete the purchase, and you will see the name Donovan Goudreau on those forms. You will also see a copy of his California driver's license, which was in his possession before he left Princeton, and you will see that Mr. Goudreau's license number is also on the firearms transaction forms, filled out in part by one of the brothers and in part by Ms. Greer. You will also learn that the address given on the form, that is the firearms transaction form, is a location which is unknown to Mr. Goudreau and is in fact an address which does not exist within the San Diego area. Ms. Greer, the firearms saleswoman, will also tell you that the purchase was made with cash and that she did not sell any ammunition when she sold the 2 shotguns. A handwriting examiner from the district attorney's office will testify about the firearms transaction forms. He will tell you that he cannot be 100% sure of whose writing appears on the forms, mainly because there's not enough handwriting on the firearms transaction forms to make a comparison. But between the signatures of Donovan Goudreau, the handwriting of Lyle Menendez, and the handwriting of Eric Menendez, the expert will tell you that the signature on the firearms transaction forms was most likely made by Eric Menendez. He will also tell you that the name Goudreau on those firearms forms is misspelled. In the summer of 1990, Lyle Menendez was ordered by a judge to provide a handwriting sample for the purpose of making comparisons for this handwriting examiner. He refused to provide a sample of his handwriting. In June of 1990, when he made this refusal, there was no way he could have known that the handwriting examiner could not make a 100% comparison because the handwriting examiner did not perform his comparison until 1992. In spite of Lyle Menendez's refusal to provide a handwriting sample, other samples of his writing were obtained in this case. I have mentioned Dr. Oziel, the therapist whose tape led to the arrest of Lyle Menendez. You will hear testimony from Dr. Oziel, and he will tell you the following. On the evening of October the 31st, 1989, approximately 2 months after the killings, and also the night of Halloween, Dr. Oziel was in his office and he called Lyle Menendez at home and asked him to come to the office. When Lyle Menendez got there, his brother Eric Menendez and Dr. Oziel were already there. Dr. Oziel informed Lyle Menendez at that time that Eric Menendez had confessed that Eric had murdered his parents. Lyle Menendez became extremely agitated and informed those present that Eric's confession was very stupid and that now it was no longer a perfect murder. Lyle Menendez was fearful that Dr. Oziel would tell someone of the brothers' participation in the killings, that he, Lyle Menendez, did not want anyone looking over his shoulder, and that is why he had killed his parents. Eric Menendez left this session before Lyle Menendez, and then Lyle Menendez left. 2 days later, on November the 2nd of 1989, the brothers again visited Dr. Oziel. At the beginning of the session, Dr. Oziel explained to Lyle Menendez why it was necessary for Eric Menendez to confess the murders to Dr. Oziel. Dr. Oziel explained that he was keeping notes of the sessions, and Lyle Menendez was alarmed by this. Dr. Oziel told the brothers that notes of those sessions were being kept in a safety deposit box, and that Dr. Oziel had given keys to this box to several attorneys, and that he, Dr. Oziel, had instructed these attorneys to open the safety deposit box if he should die mysteriously. This was Dr. Oziel's life insurance policy. Dr. Oziel explained to Lyle Menendez that he and his brother should attempt to be treated psychologically for whatever it was that had caused them to kill their parents. Lyle Menendez told Dr. Oziel that there really wasn't anything to work on because what had caused him to commit murder was no longer here. He had killed them both. During the second conversation on November the 2nd, the defendants told Dr. Oziel that they killed their father because he controlled them and made them feel inferior, while preaching morality to them. They went on to acknowledge that they saw their father as being basically a moral person. Dr. Oziel asked them why they had killed their mother. The gist of what Dr. Oziel will tell you that they told him is that Mrs. Menendez was killed because the brothers had made such a good plan to kill their father, and the plan included their mother, that they just had to keep her in the plan. According to Dr. Oziel, the brothers considered not killing their mother, but decided to go ahead anyway with her killing because their plan was too perfect to alter. Besides, they told Dr. Oziel, their mother had been depressed lately and probably would have been unable to live without their father anyway. During the rest of the November 2nd session, the brothers were entranced with the perfection of the crime that they had committed. Lyle expressed sadness at having killed his mother, but acknowledged that he had fired the shots which, in the end, had killed her. Dr. Oziel asked Lyle Menendez if he felt guilty about inheriting millions of dollars from his parents. Lyle Menendez laughed, but went on to explain that he had not committed the murders for money. Lyle Menendez told Dr. Oziel that his uncle had suspected that the family computer contained another will, which would have disinherited the brothers. Lyle explained to Dr. Oziel that he had arranged to have the computer's hard disk erased to avoid the possibility of a second will. The defendants went on to tell Dr. Oziel that they killed their parents out of hatred and a desire to be free of their father's domination and impossible standards. The defendants did not tell Dr. Oziel during these two sessions that the killings were done in self-defense or that they had suffered any physical or sexual abuse. During the second session on November the 2nd, Lyle Menendez expressed concern that the notes that Dr. Oziel had kept never be revealed. Lyle told Dr. Menendez how embarrassing it would be if he were found out. Lyle Menendez joked to the doctor that if a robber ever tried to break into Dr. Oziel's home and shoot him, he should be aware that the robber would probably be shot, and that when he looked up, he would probably see Lyle Menendez saying, "Have a good night's sleep, Jerry." Lyle Menendez had made an uneasy alliance with a man who held his secret. The remainder of the November 2nd session dealt with the defendants' upcoming trip to Hawaii and where they should stay on the islands. It is anticipated that the people's case will take less than a month to present to you. During that time, we will prove to you that Lyle Menendez planned this murder, provided false identification for the purchase of 2 shotguns, set up an alibi, acquired ammunition, repeated the alibi to the police shortly after the crime, and then set off to spend the money which he had acquired through the killings of his parents. Based upon this evidence, it will become apparent that this murder was unlawful, unjustified, and wholly premeditated, and that it was accomplished through a conspiracy into which Lyle Menendez entered with his brother, and that but for a few mistakes they made, this was almost the perfect murder. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you. All right, is the defense ready to proceed? All right, Ms. Lindsay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. I've put some photographs up there. I'm never going to be able to get from here to there, so as I speak, I'm going to merely direct your attention to the board since I have a lack of space here. Menendez killed their parents. We're not disputing where it happened, how it happened, who did it. We're not disputing when it happened. The only thing that you are going to have to focus on in this trial is why it happened. And the prosecution has suggested to you that it was done for money. It was done to commit the perfect crime. It was done possibly out of hatred. And what we will prove to you is it was done out of fear. You will be given a great deal of evidence to evaluate. In deciding whether you believe that this crime, that these children killed their parents for money, you will get an idea of what their life was like before. They were living in a Beverly Hills mansion. Lyle was attending Princeton University. He was driving the brand new Alfa Romeo he got for high school graduation. He'd had credit cards since he was 15 for both phone and to buy whatever he wanted. They had the most expensive tennis coaches. They took expensive vacations. And everyone who knew Lyle said he had, Lyle Menendez, knew he had all of the money that he needed. His father had been on a meteoric rise within the last couple of years, and things were only getting better. He was going to make more money the next year than he had the last, and more money the year after that. He was aggressive, he was talented, he was going to win at any cost. But his family was going with him wherever he went, and money was not going to be an issue. Lyle Menendez was going to be supported by, directed by, controlled by, and taken care of by his father for the rest of his life. His father had always picked his schools, his friends, tried to control his girlfriends, decided where he was going to work, what his future was going to be, and had talked of his plans to buy a compound in Florida in which there would be houses for not only Kitty and Jose Menendez, but one for Lyle and whomever he would marry, and one for Eric and whomever he would marry, and various other relatives. So there was no real concern that he was not going to have money and be taken care of all of his life. The prosecution is going to produce evidence of certain purchases, of money that was spent by Lyle Menendez after his parents died. There's information about the watches. He bought a car. He made offers on a couple of condominiums. The only one that actually ever closed was the condominium in Princeton, which his parents were in the process of buying for him, at the time of their death. It was to close in about 2 weeks. Lyle had helped pick it out, and they were going to pay for it. You will also hear that he purchased a restaurant, and you will hear from his aunt and uncle about their decision to go along with this idea because of their desire to give some structure to the chaotic existence which followed the death of his parents. You will be given information which will help you, I think, to understand the grief process, and that everyone does not experience it the same way, and that even people who kill other people mourn their loss, miss them, and love them. If this wasn't about money, then what was it about? This trial will take you behind the facade of the rich houses, the fancy cars, the wealthy friends, and impressive social engagements. It will take you to the life that was experienced by Lyle Menendez and his brother as they grew up. There's a picture on the board in the middle, which is a picture of Lyle and his little brother, Eric. All of his life, he was responsible for protecting Eric, and he didn't always do it. And in fact, he sometimes hurt his brother. And as he grew older, the responsibility that he felt for him, for this child with whom he shared a war-zone life, became even stronger, and his sense of guilt over some of his shortcomings loomed very large for him. The events which took place on August 20th, 1989, had their genesis long, long before. But immediately before the killing, in those last few days, that last week, an event began which set all of this in motion. Eric Menendez told his brother Lyle Menendez that he couldn't stand it any longer. His father had been molesting him for 12 years. It had gotten more violent, and he couldn't take it. He needed help. He couldn't get out. He couldn't leave, and he couldn't take on his father. And so he turned to his big brother. And his big brother, who had a fairly nice life going for him at the time, had spent the summer at tennis camps, was going back to Princeton in the fall to live in this new condominium, had a girlfriend all lined up that he'd been establishing a relationship with that summer, could not turn his back on his brother, that this had been going on for the 12 years. He believed Eric. He believed him because he was his brother, but more importantly, he believed him because he remembered what had happened to him when he was much younger. His experience with his father in terms of molestation had been for a much shorter period of time. It was from about 6 to 8. But he remembers what it felt like. He remembers the fear and the confusion, the importance of being loved and made to feel special by this charismatic, powerful man who was the center of his universe. He also remembered that when he was 13, he sensed something was going on with his brother. And gathering up all of his courage, he prepared for a talk with his father, as he always prepared for a talk with his father. He made notes and he rehearsed because he didn't want to lose the ability to deliver the message that he had to give him by virtue of being ridiculed for his grammar or laughed at for his lisp or in some way derailed from his purpose. And so at 13, he went to Jose Menendez and told him he knew what was going on and he wanted it to stop. And his father promised him that it would. Lyle decided that it worked when he was 13, or at least he thought it had, so he was going to try the same procedure again. He was going to talk to his dad about it. Only now he was older. He posed much more of a threat. He could tell people Maybe somebody would believe him now. He knew he wouldn't have been believed at 13. But maybe at 21, he would be believed. So he, again, prepared for a talk with his father. He made notes, he rehearsed, and then he confronted him. And he told him that he knew what had been going on, and it was going to stop. And it was going to stop now. And his father was going to let him take his little brother and leave the house. He had underestimated his father grossly. His father indicated to him in no uncertain terms that Eric Menendez was his son, and he would do whatever he wanted with his son, and that no one was going to threaten him, and no one was going to control him, and no one was going to have a secret like this with which to destroy him. He made it very clear to Lyle Menendez that this secret would never leave this family, and that the people who held this secret and this power over him would not be allowed to live. Needless to say, this was not what Lyle had envisioned. Had his brother told him before this conversation, rather than after it, the details of the torture and the sexual abuse he had endured, he would have had a clearer picture of the man with whom he was dealing. Lyle's violent experiences with his father had been, for the most part, when he was young. He respected, admired, loved his father, but more than that, wanted to be loved by his father and found worthy. He didn't think on a daily basis about all of the signs in the past, and he didn't think clearly about them before he spoke with his father. The next few days, he went back and forth between fear and hope, sure that what the message was of impending death, and yet hoping that somehow Dad, who could always fix everything, would somehow find a way out of this for the family, that somehow he would let him know it was okay. And over the next few days, different events occurred which accelerated the brothers' fear. On Friday, after this conversation with his father, on Thursday night, and after finding out from his mother that she had known all along of Eric's abuse and didn't protect him, the brothers decided to go buy handguns. That seemed like a smart way to protect themselves. What they didn't know was you can't go in and just buy a handgun. You have to wait 2 weeks. And they figured they probably wouldn't be around in 2 weeks. So they went to another gun store and they talked, and someone said, "Why don't you buy shotguns? That's what people use to protect themselves." And it didn't seem to be nearly as good as being able to have a handgun on you, but it seemed better than being there unprotected. And so they bought the shotguns. They used Donovan Boudreau's driver's license. Donovan had been a very close friend of Lyle's, far closer than Glenn Stevens. And Donovan, because of some things he had done, made a lot of people angry, and Lyle's friends, including Glenn Stevens, and Lyle's father demanded that Donovan be thrown out of the dorm room. Lyle didn't want to do it, but he knew that if he didn't, his father would come do it for him. And so Donovan was ordered out of the dorm room and left behind a number of things, a bag with a lot of objects in it, and included there Donovan Boudreau's license.
Hold on one second. My dog just kicked the cord.
And a witness will tell you
Can you guys
not
still
that
hear?
Lyle gleefully took this with some nefarious purpose, but that she found it on the floor when helping move Lyle out of the dorm room a short time later. Eric Menendez carried that driver's license because he was under 21 and physically quite similar to Donovan. On the date of the shotgun purchase, Lyle did not have a valid California driver's license. His license here had been suspended sometime before, and he'd been living in New Jersey. When the prosecution talks about this plan, this carefully crafted alibi, it so happens that Lyle Menendez had made plans to go to the movie on Sunday night sometime before. And on that day, he made a plan to meet Perry Berman and his friend Todd Hall afterwards. He wanted to be out of the house, and these plans, which the prosecution now wants to characterize as an alibi, merely proved where he wasn't.
Exactly.
Alibis generally are someone saying you were somewhere else, and they can prove it at the time of the crime. And so his plans with Perry Berman merely highlight the fact that he didn't show up where he was supposed to be. They said they went to the movies, and I guess a good plan would have been to have movie tickets, but they didn't have those either. Certain incidents happened right before the parents died, which led these children to believe that they were about to be killed. And they acted. And when it was over, they waited. Although their home was very big, it happens to be close enough to the neighbors' homes that you can hear the television set in your neighbor's house, particularly on a summer evening in August when the windows are open. They knew that when they fired off multiple rounds from shotguns, 2 of them, that everyone would hear, and they did. Any number of neighbors heard this noise. What they didn't count on is that no one called the police station, which was only minutes away. And in that period of time while they were waiting, they made a decision. Maybe we don't have to go to jail. And maybe we don't ever have to tell what happened to this family we want to be so proud of. This family of whom we are a reflection. This family with whom our identity is inextricably tied. And they turned on the light in a room which had previously been illuminated only by the television set, and they picked up shotgun shells. Somehow that seemed like the thing to do. They dumped the guns. They went to the movie theater to get tickets for the movie they were going to see, but it was too late. Couldn't buy tickets. But they did find out that one of the shows had been sold out in that trip. And then they went to the Taste of LA to try to meet their friend Perry Berman. They didn't have a real sense of what time it was and had no idea that it was far too late. And when they got there, he wasn't there. So Lyle Menendez called him on the phone. And Perry Berman will tell you that he heard something in Lyle's voice, some sort of anxiety, some heightened emotion. And he said, "I've got to see you. I've got to talk to you. It's really important. Meet us at the Cheesecake Factory." Convinced Perry to meet him there. And as they left the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium to go to the Cheesecake Factory, both of the boys continued the emotional falling apart that had begun much earlier. But Eric was far more hysterical. Eric was always very emotional, cried easily, and was falling apart. And it was up to his big brother to try and take care of him. He was the one who was supposed to be there for him. So they drove back home. They couldn't continue this any longer. They needed some resolution of it. And yet they didn't want to tell what really had happened. And so they called the police. Lyle Menendez called 911. And you will hear the tape. And there is no question that he lies in the tape. But the emotion is genuine. He goes down to the police station to be interviewed, and Sergeant Edmonds will tell you there was not a doubt in this police officer's mind that these boys were genuinely upset. But they weren't going to tell. They'd made that decision. And so they told not a sophisticated story, not a substantiated story, not of being somewhere where witnesses could say that they were. They didn't produce movie tickets. They just said we went to the movies, and then we went to Taste of LA. The police very early on suspected that the boys were responsible. They began to look at the spending, which I guess if you're going to cover up a crime, you wouldn't begin a few days later by spending a large amount of money on Rolex watches and then start making offers on condominiums and buying expensive cars.
Right, counsel, let's not argue the case, just make an open statement of what you expect the evidence to do.
We will be able to show you that there were things, that there were facts that show that this was not done for the money. The boys believed they were out of the will. Jose and Kitty had been discussing taking them out of the will, had told various people they were already out of the will, including their sons. The sons knew that their father's business was required to have a $5 million insurance policy on it. It was one of the employment perks that he had. And they knew that their father had not yet taken the physical examination and was scheduled to take it within the next few weeks. They did not know about the one insurance policy, which was the only money that they ever received after this. Their aunt had arranged that with their father, and they never even knew that it existed. The prosecution has told you of the confession to Dr. Oziel. You will hear what Dr. Oziel has to say. You'll have the opportunity to observe him. We will provide you with additional information which will assist you in evaluating Dr. Oziel's credibility. The brothers had made a decision that they were not going to reveal the family secrets. And so they gave him some information, and Dr. Oziel filled in some of the blanks himself. What you will hear in this court from Lyle Menendez, from his teachers, from his coaches, from his friends, his neighbors, his relatives, will be the story of what life was like for him and his brother. You have to remember that the child to whom some of these things happened was not the 25-year-old young man sitting here today, but the young man pictured up on the board. For Lyle, most of the sexual abuse and violence occurred in the years before he was 10. He was arrested in March of 1990, and he first spoke of his abuse, not to his lawyers, not to the media, but to his family. After he told his family, he began talking to me about it. And after that, we brought in the experts who you will see here in court. They are not the people who make their living testifying in court. You will see Dr. Stuart Hart and Dr. John Conte, both of whom are university professors, one at Washington and one at Indiana, who have made it their life work to study and evaluate violent families, psychological maltreatment, and child abuse. These experts were brought in and given free rein. They were told they could spend as much time as they wanted with Lyle Menendez. They could review any documents they wanted, see any photographs we had, interview any witnesses they wanted. And what they did was to each spend over 60 hours apiece with Lyle Menendez, just the expert, and Lyle Menendez. They then read over 2,000 pages of interviews with people. They looked at photo albums of the entire family history. They talked to me. They consulted with other experts. And they each selected 10 to 12 witnesses whom they thought were important. And they interviewed those witnesses individually. By now, each of them has spent over 300 hours on this case. They have seen and read and talked to everyone they wanted to talk to. They've met with family members. They've interviewed friends, girlfriends, coaches, and teachers. And for months, they gave no information of what their conclusion was. And they will tell you here in court what a year and a half later they have discovered. They will explain to you the type of abuse that was suffered and the effect that it had. They will explain to you what happened to Lyle Menendez and what the relationship was of those events to what happened on August 20th, 1989. Lyle Menendez will also testify here in court. You will have an opportunity to see him, to hear him, to evaluate his credibility, and to watch him be examined and cross-examined here in front of you. And what Lyle will tell you will be that he got several messages from his parents, from his mother, who didn't want him in the first place, and told him all of his life, that he had ruined her life, that she could have had a great career in broadcasting or drama, but for him. He was told on a regular basis that he was inadequate. He was humiliated, degraded, and rejected by this woman who in the last 3 years of her life was violent, unstable, drug-addicted, alcohol-dependent, and obsessive. He lived in a world of contradictions. For most of the time, the house was filthy. The laundry piled up. The ferret, who was never trained to go to the bathroom wherever he should have, went to the bathroom all over the house. They would have boxes and boxes and boxes of carnation bars and no other food. And then his mother would decide she was going to sell Shackley vitamins, and all of the toys would be thrown out and the cupboards would be filled with the vitamins. He was punished by being put under her bed where it was too small for him to turn over, which happened to be one of the areas the ferret liked to use to go to the bathroom. He will tell you of doing his term paper, and when called by her not responding soon enough, and having her rip it up in front of his eyes. He will tell you of being chased by her with a knife, of calling to her when she's in the kitchen making dinner, and her cutting herself, and her smearing her blood on his face, and making him sit through dinner, and his fear that he was going to have to go to school in that condition. He will tell you of the abandonment which a number of people saw. Kitty Menendez had to drag her children with her shopping. But her solution was to leave Lyle Menendez and his younger brother in his care and go shopping. And eventually they'd be picked up by the security guards, and eventually she would be paged, and she would tell the people she was shopping with, "That's fine, I know where they are." And the children would sit with the security guards waiting for her to come back. They would be left at school and at tennis practice for hours afterward. The message was always the same. I didn't want you in the first place, and I don't want you now. You get in the way, you ruin my life. And this was complicated by the fact that Jose Menendez took an extraordinary interest in this first child of his heir apparent. And there's an interesting photograph on the board on the left side on the bottom, which is Jose Menendez with his little boy, Lyle Menendez, in exactly the same posture, in exactly the same position, hands in pocket, foot on stairs. And Lyle Menendez was Jose's great project. What one of the relatives says, he was to be the corrected version of Jose. He was to have all of the things that Jose didn't have. Well, all of us want for our children the best. We all want for them the things we didn't have. But for him, the particular areas of concern were the fact that he did not get to have the special training and coaching so that he could have been the swimming star he thought he could have been. He lived his life humiliated by the fact that he was surrounded by Ivy League graduates, and he'd gone to Queens College. He also, for reasons that I think are described by his background, resented the fact that at age 15 he had to leave Cuba, where he loved to tell everybody he was a member of the aristocracy, and came to America. And he had to do menial work. He had to support himself. He had to wash dishes and sweep floors. He was going to get back his social position and more. And his son was going to be the prince. He was going to play tennis, have the best coaches. He was going to go to Princeton. He was going to have all the money he needed. He was not going to suffer any of the degradation of being working class, which was so offensive to Jose. And it was interesting because he ran into a woman, Mary Louise Anderson, who had a lot of the same issues. She was the daughter of a divorced family in a small Irish Catholic town in Illinois, where people didn't get divorced in the 40s, and she was ostracized. She had a violent, bigoted, cruel father who left her mother. Her mother was at first emotionally unstable enough that she was hospitalized and spent the rest of her life mourning the loss of her husband, and gave Kitty Menendez the same message that Kitty Menendez gave her children. You know, things were fine until kids came along. Kids change your life. Well, kids changed Kitty Menendez's life, because now Jose spent all the time that he wasn't either spending working or with his girlfriends, with his son. He told his son he was special. He told his son he was going to be great. He would spend hours with this little child in the basement, giving him inspirational talks, passing along motivational material, drilling him on tennis, making him repeat, making him memorize, conditioning him to have all of the thoughts that Jose thought were right, and none of his own. One of his cousins says one of the most amazing things about Lyle Menendez as a little boy was he would start a sentence to tell you what he thought. He'd glance over at his dad and see that look of disapproval, and midstream switch that sentence around to the other position, which he knew was the right one for his dad, regardless of what his own views were. The children saw Jose Menendez as all-powerful. He flaunted the law. He bragged of his illegal acts. He told with glee of firing people and destroying careers. He reveled in his sadism. He talked to them about all he could do. He was the shepherd, and the rest were the sheep, a message that he passed on to his son and made him memorize. He convinced his son that he was inept, that he was helpless, on a child with absolutely no regard.
Counsel, I said, don't argue the case. You've been going through a lot of this in argument rather than just presentation of what you expect the evidence to be.
Witnesses will tell you of a young man who was shy, introverted, and sensitive. You will hear of what dinner was like at the Menendez home, what other people called Jeopardy dinners, where you were quizzed, and the price for not knowing the answer was to be made to feel stupid. If you didn't swim well enough, you were yelled at. You were held underwater. When you played tennis, you were drilled and drilled and drilled. And where other kids played for an hour, you played for 6. And when Dad wanted to teach you reflex drills, he hit the ball as hard as he could directly at you. So that Lyle Menendez walked away from many a reflex drill with a number of welts. What happens to this child who is supposed to be perfect when it turns out he has a speech impediment? He's ridiculed, he's laughed at, he starts a sentence and is humiliated and stops talking. He walks like a duck with his feet out, and his father quacks and tells him not to walk with him. It's too embarrassing. When at 14 he's still wetting the bed, his sheets appear on the breakfast room table. When he brings a rabbit home from school and his mother says, your father wants to have you get rid of it, and he doesn't do it for a few days, he comes home and asks his mother where the rabbit is. She says, ask your father. And his father tells him, go to the garbage. And there is the rabbit with its head smashed. Others who lived in that house knew that when Jose took off his belt, someone was going to get beaten. You didn't know who, and you didn't know why. And when Lyle had the nerve to go into a deli at about age 7 and buy some junk food and his father looked in the bag, he didn't lecture him about health or rotten teeth. He just socked him in the stomach. And when in wrestling, Lyle grabbed him in his genitals, playing around during the time he was being molested, Jose took him and threw him into a table, a coffee table. And you will still see the scar on his eye. And we have a photograph, and we have medical records. Lyle also has a scar that runs down his lip to his chin. When he was about 16, he was out practicing tennis. And his father watched him and came and harassed him and pushed him in ways that his coach said he'd never seen done before. And when Lyle yelled at him to shut up, his father grabbed him, put him in the limousine, which was his father's usual means of transportation, grabbed him by the throat, and socked him square in the face, and said, "If you ever embarrass me again, I will kill you." The Menendez family blended sex and violence. They showed porno films to neighbors who were outraged and then bragged that they'd shown them to the children. They had no boundaries. The boys showered with their father up to the very end, and their mother in their teens was still coming in the bathtub and bathing them and washing their hair. The problem is children love their parents and want to be loved by them. And so they stay, and they endure, and they believe they are responsible. And between the years...
Yes, counsel, again, this is not the opportunity to argue the case. It's the opportunity to give the jury an idea of what you expect the evidence to be.
Okay. Between the years of 6 and 8, around the time Lyle was playing soccer, as you can see from the picture on the right, his father extended these intense conversations into massages. He told them that this was the type of thing that the Romans did, that this is what fathers and sons do, that he was special, that this was a special bond that they had. And he began the sexual molestation. And Lyle felt confusion and fear, but he also liked the attention, and he also liked the fact that Dad thought he was important. But as things progressed, objects were used, which hurt, and eventually there was an anal rape, which hurt even more. Lyle confronted his dad, screamed at him, told his mother, "Please ask Dad to leave me alone, he's hurting me." She said, "Your dad loves you. You have to be punished sometimes." The teachers will tell you of the pressure that they saw and of the sadness they saw. And they will admit to you that they didn't interfere and they didn't protect these children because they were afraid of the parents. They were afraid of Jose Menendez, and they were afraid of Kitty Menendez. The coaches will tell you of the brutality and the control exhibited through the lessons, and those who wouldn't go to the extent that was required were fired. In 1986, the family moved to California, and about this time, Kitty Menendez discovered that her husband had been having an affair for approximately 8 years. An already unstable woman now got worse. She was seeing a therapist on a regular basis. She was taking massive dosages of antidepressant drugs. She was drinking. She was acting in all kinds of obsessive ways. She was leaving suicide notes for her sons. She was attempting suicide. She was threatening to poison the family. A crazy woman got even crazier. During the last week, Lyle and Eric Menendez talked to each other about experiences that each of them had had that the others didn't even know about. They talked about a mother who was willing to die and willing to kill. They talked about a father who was not going to be controlled by anyone or anything. They talked about parents who can treat their children as objects, who can abuse and use and degrade them. And they knew that these were parents who could kill their children.
Before I do, let me again say that all that you heard so far is...
Right, so that was the opening statements for Lyle Menendez. This is the 1993 trial, and I think we're going to go into, so we'll go into the opening statements for Eric here.
A night when the maid, the Menendez household maid, was not there. The defendants had a ready alibi when questioned by police. Eric Menendez told the police that he and his brother went to see Batman in Century City, and that they then went to Santa Monica to the Taste of LA. It was some kind of a wine tasting function. According to Eric Menendez, they just happened to come back home to pick up some false ID, some fake ID for a night on the town when they came upon the brutal slaying of their parents. The defendants were the ones to call 911 and report the killings initially to the police. The investigation into the murders of Mary and Jose Menendez was thus begun. The investigation revealed that Jose Menendez suffered a shotgun wound to the back of his head, as well as 4 other shotgun wounds. Mary Menendez suffered 10 shotgun wounds, including a contact wound to her left cheek. 2 shotgun blasts shattered panes in the French doors in the family room where the victims were killed. On August 24th, 1989, 4 days after the killings, Eric and Lyle Menendez went to Slavic Jewelers in Beverly Hills and purchased Rolex watches and money clips for some $15,000. The defendants thereafter collected $200,000 each on September 8, 1989, and another $125,000 each on September 15, 1989, in insurance proceeds from their father's life insurance policy. In addition to the defendant's alibi, the evidence will show that Eric Menendez tried to pin the crimes on others. On November 29, 1989, over 2 months after the slayings, and with the investigation ongoing, Eric Menendez claimed that hitmen were responsible for the murders. He also claimed that Castro might be involved in the murders because his father, Jose Menendez, wanted to liberate Cuba. Defendant Eric Menendez was secretly taped in a conversation that he had with Craig Signorelli at Gladstone's restaurant in Malibu over dinner on November 29, 1989. The defendant is heard to say, "I've known from the beginning. No clues, no one heard anything." The defendant then states his belief that Castro might have been involved in the killing of his parents. The defendant then says, "Man, we're talking about special hitmen, special shotguns, and knew exactly what they were doing in and out of the house. No one saw anything, no one heard anything. We're talking about serious hitmen." The evidence will show that the defendants nearly got away with their crimes. They had meticulously picked up all the shotgun shells from the family room. They had buried the shotguns, and they had indeed an alibi. With the investigation nearing 7 months in duration, the Beverly Hills Police Department finally received a break in the case. Information which led to a search warrant on the home and office of Beverly Hills psychologist Jerome Oziel and the seizing of evidence implicating the defendants. With information relating to this evidence, Lyle Menendez was arrested on March 8, 1990, and defendant Eric Menendez was arrested on March 11, 1990 for the murders of Jose and Mary Menendez. Dr. Oziel will testify then on Halloween, October 31st, 1989, the defendant, Eric Menendez, said that he was having vivid dreams of his parents being murdered. He told Dr. Oziel, "We did it." Dr. Oziel asked him if he meant that he and Lyle had murdered his parents. Eric Menendez responded yes. Eric Menendez then said that his father was too controlling. He criticized them, he made them feel inadequate, and prevented them from doing what they wanted to do. He said that he and his brother discussed killing their father and getting him out of their lives. They couldn't see any freedom with their father around. Together, they decided to kill him. Pursuant to this conspiracy, the defendants drove all the way to San Diego and purchased 2 Mossberg shotguns with false identification 2 days before they would actually do the murders. Eric Menendez said that his mother had to be killed also because she would have been a witness and would have been miserable and suicidal without their father anyway. Eric Menendez told Dr. Oziel that he and Lyle surprised their parents walking into the room with their pump shotguns. Eric Menendez said his father cried out, "No, no, no." The brothers then began to blast away. After they had emptied their shotguns into their mother and father, their father was dead. But Eric said their mother, who ultimately sustained 10 shotgun wounds, was moaning on the floor and tried to crawl away. According to Eric Menendez, the brothers went back out to the car and reloaded, and Lyle then returned to finish off their mother. Eric Menendez said that he picked up the shotgun cartridge casings, removed their blood-spattered clothes, and placed their clothes into a bag. They put fresh clothes on and drove to a garbage dumpster where they threw away the bloody clothes and took their shotguns and buried them down an embankment off of Mulholland Drive. They then went to a wine tasting party to meet with Perry Berman. Mr. Berman was not there, so they arranged to meet him later that night. The defendants then returned to their house and called 911 as if they had just come upon the murder scene. The defendant, Eric Menendez, said that his father had recently nearly disinherited him, and he told Dr. Oziel that that was another reason to get rid of his father. Eric Menendez said that there was no way to link them to the crime, since the fingerprints were their fingerprints, since they lived at the house, and there were no witnesses. No one could link them to the weapons, he felt. The weapons were not recovered by the police. He believed there was no way to tie them to buying the shotguns in San Diego. There was no way to link them to the murders in his mind. Eric Menendez said that they felt that they could never equal their father's accomplishments. Eric Menendez was pleased, however, at having pulled off the murders without being caught. The defendants said that they killed their father out of a desire to be free of his control, criticism, and impossible standards. Dr. Oziel, when he asked them why they killed their mother also, The defendant, Eric Menendez, said he discussed with his brother the fact that their mother did not deserve to die, but their plan was perfect, and they did not want to change the plan. The evidence will show that in January of 1988, Eric Menendez was involved in writing a screenplay in which the hero is...
Right, the objection is sustained at this point on that issue. Move on to something else.
I could not hear what the objection was, but I heard him say it was sustained. So I don't know. His mic was not on, the judge.
Your Honor, there has been a previous ruling on this. The evidence will show that the defendant, Eric Menendez, went to great lengths to cover up his crime, including lying to the police and blaming professional hitmen for what he and his brother had done. Eric Menendez bragged about committing the perfect murder, and he almost got away with it. The evidence will show... The evidence will show that Eric Menendez is guilty of premeditated and deliberate murders, the premeditated and deliberate murders of Mary and Jose Menendez.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kuriyama. Ms. Abramson for the defense.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. This is large, but the print is very big, so it isn't going to take as long as it looks. This is opening statement, and as the court has indicated, this is supposed to be an outline of the evidence that we intend to prove both through live witnesses, through exhibits, through analysis of evidence. If this were a closing argument, you would properly expect me to start refuting what my opponent, Mr. Kuriyama, has just said. But this is not closing, this is opening. And the purpose of opening statement by the defense is to let you know what evidence we will be producing when our turn comes to put on our case. By telling you now what we intend to prove later, it is our hope and it is our expectation that you will do what you have promised to do during the jury selection process. You will keep an open mind. You will wait to hear both sides of the case. And
Objection, Your Honor, this is argumentative.
Yeah, let's just get to what you expect the evidence to be.
Well, I will, Your Honor. Mr. Kuriyama just told you that you will find his evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt of first-degree murder. It is for you to wait until you have heard all the evidence for you to decide what is the truth.
Objection, Your Honor, this is argumentative.
All right, I think you were just about to finish what you were going to say.
Yes,
Mr.
Your Honor, I'm refuting what Mr. Kuriyama just said.
All right, without arguing with Mr. Kuriyama and without arguing with anybody, you can finish your
Thank you, Your Honor.
your remarks.
And decide whether the presumption of innocence has been overcome by proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Eric Menendez is guilty of what he is charged with here, first-degree murder. At the end of the case, the judge will tell you what the law is that applies to this case, and he will instruct you on theories. Your job will first be to decide what are the true facts, and how do they apply to the law as the judge gives it to you. Eric Menendez has entered a plea of not guilty to what he is charged with, first-degree murder with special circumstance. But as you may have learned during the
Objection,
jury...
Your Honor, I believe this is argumentative. She's going to give an opening statement. I think it's...
Okay,
Your Honor,
Mr.
can we watch?
Kuriyama, let's not argue and sit down, and you can be seated, Mr. Kuriyama. And Ms. Abramson, you are going afield here. Let's go to what you expect the evidence to be rather than how it relates to the legal theories.
I wasn't going to relate it to the legal theories.
Okay, well,
I
you're
was
going
merely
beyond
gonna-
what you anticipate here. Let's go on to the evidence.
All right. It will be your job to decide what kind of killing this is. That depends on what you come to believe was the reason for the act. The only question in this case is why did these killings occur? There is no issue as to who killed Jose and Mary Louise Menendez. Why they were killed is what the focus of all of our evidence will be on. We intend to provide you with the answer to that question. The following recitation of facts is a summary of what many, many witnesses, including Eric Menendez himself, will testify to. On Sunday, August 20th, 1989, Eric Menendez, 18 years old, along with his 21-year-old brother, Lyle Menendez, shot and killed their parents in their home on Elm Drive in Beverly Hills at approximately 10 p.m. They shot their parents with 2 shotguns they had bought in a store in San Diego 2 days before, on Friday, August 18th. At the time of the purchase, for which Eric Menendez signed the paperwork, they used the driver's license of a young man named Donovan Goudreau, who was a former friend of Lyle Menendez. Eric Menendez had carried Donovan Goudreau's driver's license for some time, both because he had lost his own license and because the Goudreau license, Donovan Goudreau being 21, allowed Eric Menendez entry into places that he otherwise would be barred from as underage. Having fired 2 shotguns in the middle of a residential neighborhood on a quiet night, Eric and Lyle Menendez expected an immediate police response. They waited. When no one came, they decided to leave and pretend that they had not been home at the time of the shooting. For the next hour, they engaged in a frantic and feeble effort to construct an alibi. They went to a nearby movie complex in the hopes of obtaining tickets for a showing in progress. They discarded the guns and the used shotgun shells. Eric discarded some clothing he had worn during the shooting. And they attempted to meet up with a friend in Santa Monica. Although they called a friend who was then at home and arranged a further meeting, Eric Menendez was by this time incapable of functioning. He was falling apart. Therefore, they went home, and Lyle called the police. When the police arrived, they observed that Eric Menendez was obviously, visibly, dramatically hysterical. The prosecution will claim he was faking. Experienced police officers, his tennis coach who knew him and who came to the scene, saw that he was not faking. He was, as one of the officers will testify, traumatized. Later that early morning, he was interviewed by the police, and he lied to them. He was 18 years old. He had had a lifetime of abuse. He was in a state of shock, and he did not want to go to jail. Over the next weeks and months, Eric Menendez was torn by guilt, by remorse, by horror over what he had done, and his distress was visible to many witnesses. His family in New Jersey sent him to see a doctor. He had lost a tremendous amount of weight. He was suffering constant nightmares. He was repeatedly reliving the killings in the way that some Vietnam War veterans relive their experiences. The proof of this was that he told the police months later that he could still smell the smoke. Although he had done the act, he was traumatized by it and could not live with his guilty conscience. Now, you will hear expert testimony that this is not the post-crime mental state of a cold-blooded, calculating killer. This is the condition that a decent person, however imperfect, having been driven to do a violent act, regretting that violent act, finds himself in. As further proof of his lack of calculation, he confessed his involvement in his parents' killing within weeks. His first confession, in a rather tentative way, was to Craig Signorelli, who will be a witness for the prosecution in this case. Later, finding himself closer and closer to suicide, he confessed to L. Jerome Oziel. He did not tell either Craig Signorelli nor L. Jerome Oziel the whole story, for many reasons which will be explained to you, but not the least being a lack of trust in either of them. He did not tell them the true motivation for the killings. To do that, he would have had to reveal the shameful, in his opinion, secrets that he had spent most of his life concealing. But what he could not and did not do with them, he will do with you. He will tell you why he killed his parents. He will tell you the entire painful and difficult and complicated story of his life. On March 8, 1990, Lyle Menendez was arrested in Beverly Hills. Eric Menendez was in Israel on a professional tennis tour. When he learned of his brother's arrest, and knew, of course, that the Beverly Hills police wanted to arrest him as well, he voluntarily got on an airplane, flew to London, from London to Florida, from Florida to Los Angeles. He was not in police custody. He came back voluntarily. He surrendered to Detective Zoller, knowing that by doing so, he was facing the gas chamber. Many witnesses will contribute their observations of Eric Menendez and his family over the years to present as complete a picture as possible of the treatment he and his brother received at the hands of their parents. Because the origin of this killing was a lifetime of abuse at the hands of those same parents. The characterizations of Jose and Mary Louise Menendez that follow as I recite the facts of that life to you are not my opinions. They are the impressions of people who knew them, of people who will testify about them to you. They are also the impressions, the evaluations, the profiling, if you will, of our expert witnesses in the field of battered children and battering parents. Our witnesses, who are family members, teachers, coaches, friends of the parents, friends of the sons, business associates of Jose Menendez, therapists who treated Mary Louise Menendez, and Eric Menendez himself, will paint a portrait of Jose and Mary Louise Menendez as parents that will make understandable to you how they could have died at the hands of their children, what they did to their children to bring this about. Our expert witnesses, we believe, are among the most highly credentialed professionals in the areas of research into child abuse and the evaluation and treatment of abused children. These are people, some of whom have never testified for the defense in a case before. They have been prosecution witnesses most of their careers. They will tell you what the effects of maltreatment are on a child, how these effects continue into adolescence and early adulthood, and most importantly, how the child shaped by abuse can be expected to react to threatening situations emanating from the abusers. They will try to teach you something that many of you may know a good deal about already, and that many of you will have only had a passing reference to. And that is what happens to the personality structure and the character structure of a child who does not get those basic things that we all know children need. And they will tell you how much worse the damage is when those children receive harmful and traumatic experiences at the hands of the people who are supposed to be nice. They will tell you how the personalities and perceptions of abused children fall into predictable patterns. How over the past 10 to 15 years, our awakening awareness and concern for the welfare of children has resulted in a large body of research in which profiles of abusive parents and of abused children have emerged. And most important, they will share with you their exhaustive evaluations of Eric Menendez. Each evaluation conducted for over more than 40 hours of interviewing with him. One of the experts has spent more than 200 hours with him. And their opinions that he indeed is a young man who suffered extreme forms of lifelong sexual, emotional, and physical abuse at the hands of both of his parents. Their opinions are not just based on their interviews with and their impressions of Eric Menendez alone. They are also supported by an extensive battery of objective psychological testing that was administered to Eric Menendez by a highly experienced forensic psychologist. The experts also examined all of Eric Menendez's school records and medical records. They read thousands of pages of witness interviews and interviewed witnesses who will be testifying here. And they examined the crime scene evidence, the same evidence that will be presented to you in this case by the prosecution. So what was it then that was done to Eric Menendez, and how did these events lead to homicide? The simple answer, which takes 28 pages to explain, and upon which we will expand in detail during trial, is this. For 12 years, between the ages of 6 and 18, my client, Eric Menendez, was sexually molested by his father. The pattern of molestation in which Jose Menendez engaged started out as inappropriate touching and arousal of his young son, and escalated in a carefully calculated pattern of grooming the child for his father's sexual gratification. This pattern included repeated acts of forcible oral copulation, sodomy, and rape and the intentional infliction of pain by the use of foreign objects upon Eric's person. Jose Menendez's obvious purpose was to use his child's body to satisfy his lust. But this sexual exploitation of his young son was also part of a more pervasive characteristic of Mr. Menendez: his absolute need to control and to manipulate the people around him. Many witnesses will tell you that this was a man who enjoyed to an extraordinary degree asserting his power over those weaker than himself, especially his boys. Some of the witnesses who will testify in this case and who will support this characterization of Jose Menendez loved him in life and love him now. He was physically strong, aggressive, intense, driven, and supremely arrogant. He was a man who has been described as knowing no boundaries. Many people, adults and children alike, saw the same intimidating characteristics in him that kept his children in constant fear of his displeasure. Many also saw his intelligence, some say brilliance, and the charm he could turn on and off at will, and were unsurprised by his children's obvious adulation of him. Witnesses will tell you that Mr. Jose Menendez thought himself a superior being and indoctrinated his children into believing that he was in all respects perfect, that their family was superior to other families, that their way of life was superior to others, that being rich was all that mattered, that people who were not successful, according to his terms, were sheep. And he indoctrinated his children in an effort to get them to share those views. What he did get was total obedience from his sons. As our experts will tell you, Mr. Menendez, as a perpetrator of incest, was true to his aggressive, competitive, and fundamentally violent nature. As you will learn, not all incestuous parents are violent towards their victims. Yet even the children of this so-called loving corruption feared death at the hands of their violators. This is because when a child is treated as an object of an adult's sexual desires, the child senses that he is not a person to that adult, just a thing. And instinctively the child knows that things get broken and destroyed. Here, though, young Eric Menendez had more vivid examples of his father's potential lethality towards him. This, after all, was a man, you will hear, who pulled Eric's hair when forcing this 11-year-old to orally copulate him, who slapped him repeatedly when the child cried after his father ejaculated into his mouth for the first time, who forcibly sodomized him after repeated prior attempts caused the child to cry out in pain. For this act, Jose Menendez waited until no one else was home, presumably because he knew it would cause excruciating pain and that the child would scream. This, too, was a man who, in Eric Menendez's early adolescence, decided that as part of an already pervasive system of hardening or toughening up his child by terrorizing him, by purposely placing him in frightening situations, by coaching him in sports by methods so brutal they resulted in the child passing out on the tennis court, nearly drowning in the swimming pool, this man decided to add the intentional infliction of pain to his sexual activities with the boy. His excuse was that his son had shown himself not a Menendez. He had shown himself to be a weakling, because when receiving a shot in a doctor's office, Jose Menendez's son had cried. Therefore, Dad was going to make his son impervious to pain. He used a variety of objects: needles, tacks, wooden implements, knotted ropes. These episodes are what Eric Menendez calls the dark days. He and the experts will tell you that these dark days taught him many lessons: how not to feel physical pain, how not to think about terrible things that are happening to you while they are happening, how to hate yourself and feel yourself a coward, and how to never trust an adult, especially one who is supposed to love and care for you. Now, I'm sure that you sense that acts of incest such as these are crimes. But unlike the alleged crime that the prosecution here presents, those crimes occurred in total secrecy. No police were called, no crime scene photographs were taken, no one took Eric Menendez's part as a child to vindicate his repeated victimization. Well, let me amend that. One such crime scene, the scene of forcible sodomy and oral copulation and assault by Jose Menendez on his son, was photographed, by the Beverly Hills Police Department. And you will see those photographs, photographs of Eric Menendez's bedroom in the house on Elm Drive. For these crimes did not stop in the boy's early adolescence. The molestation continued right up until the week before the homicides, right there in that bedroom on Elm Drive. And as Eric wondered as a child, you may also wonder, what of that other adult who was to love and care for him? What of his mother, while these violations by Dad are occurring over the months and years of this boy's childhood? 3 days before she died, Mary Louise Menendez admitted to her son, the son that everyone says adored her, that she knew all along of his father's molesting him. For years, Eric Menendez had suspected and then refused to believe that his mother knew. He loved his mother. He wanted desperately for her to love him. And although the evidence of such feelings towards him on her part was very slim at best, he chose to believe, he needed to believe, that however much his father may have hated him, his mother must love him in her own way. He could not tell her himself what was going on for many reasons. In the early stages of Jose Menendez's seduction of his son, which our experts will tell you is a classic pattern among incestuous males, he told the child that this was their special secret, to be shared with no one. And this younger son, so unused to any affectionate treatment from his ever-critical father, who so often compared him unfavorably with his older, smarter, stronger, and more talented brother, this child, wanting his father's love, believed that these early sexual acts, which his father called massages and mouth massages, were affection. He would not risk losing that affection by disobeying Dad's command of secrecy. Later on, when it got ugly and violent, Eric Menendez felt that he was the one that had done something wrong. He blamed himself for what he perceived was a loss of Dad's affection and felt he had nothing to complain about. Moreover, as many people will testify, his mother seemed angry at him and his brother all the time. She had uncontrollable rages over seemingly meaningless things. She never comforted him when he was ill. Indeed, she never acknowledged that he was ill, and punished him for staying home from school with physical complaints by locking him in a closet while she ran errands. She constantly criticized him for his poor schoolwork, calling him stupid and dummy, and forced him into that same closet to do his homework when she imagined him not working hard enough. But she acted like she was afraid of his father, and it was obvious that his father treated her with a great deal of disrespect, both inside their home and in front of other people. So in spite of her harshness towards him, Eric Menendez long believed that his mother was Dad's victim too. And he felt protective towards her. He didn't want to burden her with his problems. In thinking about telling her about the molestation, particularly when he was throwing up after an episode with Dad, or was in pain, or was bleeding, he thought if he went to her, it might break up the family, assuming she would believe him and not blame him and do something about it. And he had been told since he was tiny that this family was the center of the universe and was totally involved with his parents in every aspect of his life. But part of him was also afraid of finding out that she wouldn't care and wouldn't help if he told her. So he didn't. Did she know, though, as Eric Menendez says she admitted just before her death? You will have to decide. You will have to weigh the evidence. 12 years of sexual acts in her own home, often as frequently as twice a month. You will have to ask the question, why did she never enter her son's room when Jose Menendez was alone with him? Why did she never attend to her son when he was throwing up in the bathroom?
Objection, this is argument, Your Honor.
Objection sustained. Let's get back to
All right.
the
You
recitation
will-
of evidence rather than your comment on the evidence.
This is not my comment, Your Honor. You will
Okay,
hear
it's my
testimony.
observation that it is a comment, so let's go back to
I'll
what it
reframe
is.
it, Your Honor. You will hear evidence that she never attended to her son while he was throwing up in the bathroom next door to her bedroom after a sexual episode with the father. But she would come if Eric were throwing up due to illness and complain about the mess. You will hear evidence that she never asked Eric why he was crying after Dad left his room, but instead taught him to put water in his eyes to erase the signs of his tears. You will also hear evidence that up until the age of 15, Eric's mother would periodically make her son submit to her physical inspections of his genitals, which she called checking you out. Was she concealing sick and embarrassing secrets that her therapist in California believed were sexually related? Witnesses will describe Mary Louise Menendez as a woman obsessed with status and social position, the day-to-day enforcer of a pressure cooker training program for her boys. Contemporaries of these boys describe the Menendez home as boot camp. People describe Mary Louise Menendez as a cold and distant, some say hostile parent towards her children. But her most striking characteristic to all who knew her and all who will testify about her here is that she was an extremely secretive and private person. Now, no family, not even normal families, are perfect. Yet Mary Louise Menendez portrayed hers as such. She was closest to her sister-in-law, Terry Baralt, Jose Menendez's sister, yet she lied to Aunt Terry regularly. She claimed, for example, that the boys were superior students, yet her younger son was barely average. She concealed from the world that Eric Menendez had learning disabilities, had trouble with understanding oral instruction, and was dyslexic. She knew these things because the schools that he was enrolled in pointed these things out to her. She never gave him remedial treatment. In fact, the Princeton Day School, where Eric was enrolled for part of grammar school and junior high school, signed him up for a special after-school learning class for children with disabilities, and his mother made sure that he never attended. People will tell you that it was clear that her attitude was that her children, one of her sources of prestige and status, had to be perceived as perfect for her to be perceived as superior. So she sacrificed her son's need to learn to her need to be seen as a superior person like her husband. Aunt Terry Baralt, to whom Mary Louise Menendez spoke every day, knew nothing of her nephew's learning problems, knew nothing of any trouble in the family. But she knew of Mary Louise Menendez's competitiveness, of her desire to raise winners, of her theory that you ignored your child's fears in order to make him tough, of her being a mother who rarely, if ever, displayed affection towards her younger son once he passed out of babyhood. As you will hear from a number of witnesses, including Eric Menendez, it was his mother who made sure that he trained for and competed in all the competitive level athletics that she and Jose Menendez pushed the children into. Swimming at 3, soccer at 6, tennis at 11. And she was as driven and as critical of less than perfect performance as was their father. With a schedule that left him no time for studying, with learning disabilities that made schoolwork difficult, she still demanded that her son pull down high grades. It did not seem to matter if he learned anything. Grades were the only measure of success. And to succeed, as that was defined in this family, meant win, win, and win. Be number one at all costs. A relative will testify that Jose Menendez's credo for success was cheat, steal, lie, but win. And since winning was all that mattered to Mrs. Menendez as well, she encouraged her children to cheat if necessary to win, and participated in their cheating at school. She did much of their schoolwork herself, a fact that many of the teachers recognized. But those teachers will tell you that they were also intimidated by her and her husband, and although they knew there was trouble in that family, they never interfered. Jose and Mary Louise Menendez's efforts to isolate their children from the influence of any other adults was highly successful. Their son knew that no one ever stood up to them. He knew the power of his parents. He knew there were no adults who could rescue him. So for years he did the best he could, tried hard, won trophies for his parents, all the while struggling with thoughts of suicide and death and shame. Early in his adolescence, Eric Menendez's life improved slightly. His brother, who he idolized, became his friend. Jose Menendez had always compared Eric unfavorably to his older brother and had encouraged the boys to compete with and distrust each other. You will hear an expert's description of Jose Menendez's style of running his family as being classic divide and conquer. Make each member of the family think that his was the only approval worth gaining and that none had allies in each other. Lyle Menendez was a typical big brother. Sometimes he acted like a bully when Eric Menendez was small. But in early teenage, Eric's older brother started to defend him in small and subtle ways, the only ways Lyle Menendez dared in the face of his father's menace, defend him against the threat of Jose Menendez's physical and psychological attacks. Eric Menendez had always had few friends and fewer confidants. So his brother became, during that stage of his life and thereafter, the one person on earth it felt safe to love. 15-year-old Eric Menendez sustained himself with two thoughts. One, God may bring him a miracle, and the harshest part of his life, the sickening sex with Dad, might end somehow. And two, and more realistic, someday he would go off to college, and Dad wouldn't be able to come into his room anymore. God seemed to deliver on Eric Menendez's longed-for miracle when during the summer of 1986, shortly after they had purchased a brand new house in Princeton, New Jersey, Jose Menendez announced to his startled family that he had taken a job in California. Eric Menendez could not wait to leave the scene of so many humiliations and pain. And indeed, during the first 6 months in California, it really appeared that his prayers had been answered, because inexplicably, there was no sex with Dad during that time. But then again, something else became very apparent in California. There was trouble between his parents, and Mom was falling apart. Eric overheard conversations in which he learned that his mother had discovered that for 8 years, Dad had been having an affair, and Mary Louise Menendez was consumed by her own shock and suffering. Lyle Menendez had stayed behind in New Jersey to go to school when the rest of the family moved to California. Therefore, Eric Menendez was left alone much of the time with a mother who secreted herself in her bedroom and cried for weeks on end. Eventually, she started therapy, which continued until she died. But she never got better. She never got over the affair. She never got close to dealing with all the other problems of her family. Something else was new about Mom in California. She relentlessly pressured her son to get a girlfriend. She set him a deadline. He had 6 months to comply. Now, Eric Menendez was 16, and he had had no experiences whatsoever with girls up until that time. He had always been very afraid that if he got close to a girl, she would somehow figure out what was going on with Dad. But he could not defy his mother, so he got a girlfriend. She was a very sweet, you may see her here, a sweet and innocent girl to whom he became obsessively devoted. But at the same time, he was full of doubts about himself as a male. He still believed, even at 16, that the sex with Dad was somehow, at least partially, his fault. He must have done something to bring this on himself. There must be something about him that would make his father treat him that way. He was half convinced that he was homosexual. He feared that people knew or could tell that he was different. Eric Menendez's friends from the last 3 years before the homicides will testify to what he was like then. As a high school tennis star, he was admired. He made friends with the other tennis players. He was inventive and interesting and fun. But he was also unusually anxious. He seemed preoccupied with a million things on his mind. His tutors described him as someone who would suddenly space out in the middle of a lesson and they couldn't get him back. And he was hidden. He was secretive. And friends will say that they noticed that he lied to his parents about totally insignificant things. Now, these teenagers, or former teenagers, will say they lied to their parents too, but usually when they did something wrong. Eric was lying to his parents about every single detail of his life. Our experts will explain to you that when you take a child whose entire life has been structured around secrets and the concealing of secrets, keeping secrets becomes a high priority. And when that child has had parents that have intruded into every aspect of his life, in fact, for the last year before the homicides, Jose and Mary Louise Menendez were tapping Eric's phone, something he did not know until they died, and he found the tapes, and with the help of one of the security guards at the Elm Drive house, he found the recording device. Well, those experts will tell you that a child who is in adolescence needs some sense of separation, some sense of privacy, some illusion of control over his life. And lying to the intruders is the most minimal but somewhat effective way of creating some sense of freedom. Eric had some very strange ideas about his parents because of their behavior and their strangeness over the years. And during that period just before the homicides, he will tell you that he genuinely believed that his mother had supernatural powers. First of all, because she often acted very strangely. And second of all, because she knew all these things that he was purposely concealing from her. Now later, of course, he learned she was tapping the phone, but at that time, he hadn't a clue. And so she seemed a very powerful and a very frightening person. In the spring of 1989, you will hear testimony that Jose Menendez was greatly displeased by his younger son. In his opinion, Eric Menendez was being rebellious. The boy was actually refusing to report to his father the hourly details of his tennis practice. And he was refusing to tell his father exactly what aspect of his tennis game he worked on during each structured hour of practice. Now, this may seem absurd to us, but this was one of the many minute demands that Jose Menendez made on Eric Menendez. And it was a radical departure for Eric at 18 to not be telling his father the minute-to-minute details of his sports involvement. There was no question that Eric was training every single day and training hard, because over the coming summer he was going to compete in the Junior National Tennis Championships. And he was higher ranked than in any previous year, so he had a good chance of winning, and the parental pressure was on him in a major way. He was also planning on attending UCLA in the fall, and was expected to make the UCLA tennis team, which he had to compete for, and which was one of the best in the country. So he was devoted to tennis that spring, totally focused. But as a consequence of that focus, and as a consequence of the parental pressure that sports and winning was more important than school, he was cutting a lot of classes in order to maintain his tennis training, and his grades were suffering. By this time, Eric will tell you that sex was used by his father mainly as a form of punishment. There was no longer any propaganda that it was normal, what the Roman soldiers did, the lies that Jose Menendez used to seduce his son when he was younger. It was clear to Eric that now the sex was a show of force and dominance and nothing else. And Eric Menendez hated himself for not being strong enough to stop it. In May of 1989, Jose Menendez sodomized his son for the last time in a rage over the boy's silence about his tennis training and his anticipated failing grade in chemistry. Eric Menendez's only consolation, the thing that sustained him, that had sustained him for years, he will tell you, was that he would escape to the dorm at UCLA in September, and this degrading chapter in his life would finally end. During July and August of 1989, Eric Menendez traveled with his parents to the three venues, the three different cities, where the tennis championships were conducted. He played hard, and he did rather well, but not good enough for his father. When he lost the last match he played, his father's fury was worse than anything Eric had ever experienced in the past. Returning to California on August 9th, Eric Menendez was determined to endure as best he could until school started. A week before the homicides, Jose Menendez once again displayed his intention to continue his domination over his son. He announced to his son that although he would ostensibly live at the dorm at UCLA, he would be required to sleep at home several days a week so that his parents could monitor his schoolwork. Eric Menendez understood immediately what this meant. The sex was going to continue. And all of the hope that he had sustained himself on all of the years, the method by which he pushed away thoughts of suicide, vanished. Following this announcement, Eric Menendez packed some clothes, planning to leave the house for a few days. He couldn't bear to be around his father in the state of despair that he now was in. His mother and his father stopped him and said what they had said before when he had made efforts to run away, that they would always find him, that there was no escaping them, and that he could never survive on his own. His father also told him that he would deal with him more fully when he returned from a business trip he was taking that week. On Tuesday, August 15th, Jose Menendez left on his trip. Later that day, Eric Menendez observed an argument between his mother and his brother. In the course of the argument, Mrs. Menendez ripped the hairpiece off her older son's head. Until that point, Eric Menendez didn't even know that his brother had lost much of his hair and wore a hairpiece. It suddenly became clear to Eric that everyone in this family keeps secrets. With Lyle Menendez's secret revealed, Eric did what for years he had been warned against doing. He told his brother what his father had been doing to him. And he will describe to you the details of that fateful conversation. Because what it led to was a determination on Lyle Menendez's part to come to the aid of his baby brother. The form of that aid was to be a confrontation with their father, in which Lyle Menendez was going to insist that Jose Menendez stop molesting his son and allow the brothers to leave the home and live together. Eric Menendez will tell you that this decision led to days of intense tension and dread on his part. He was terrified of what his father would do once he learned that he, Eric, had revealed the secret. But he had such confidence in his big brother, and he wanted so much to believe that his big brother could help him, that he also had tiny moments of hope over those days. Maybe it would work. Maybe he could get away. On Thursday night, Jose Menendez returned from his trip and met with his older son. The meeting was a disaster. Jose Menendez was defiant. "He is my son, and I will do what I want with him," Lyle Menendez later reported to his brother. And now let me say something about this. Our experts will testify about their experiences, which are extensive, not just with abused children, but with abusing parents. And what may sound very peculiar to us now, they will tell you is not unusual. That although most molesters deny it, when they admit it, they justify their behavior. They seem to believe they have the right, or they have the power, or the child didn't mind, or he really must have liked it. They have their own sick ways of rationalizing it. And you will hear from our experts that given Jose Menendez's entire personality and character structure, this outrageous statement fit his pattern. But worse than this outrageous statement was Jose Menendez's reaction to Lyle's threat, improvidently made, to go public with the secret if Jose didn't stop. Eric Menendez experienced his father's reaction to his brother's threat firsthand through a series of violent and hysterical confrontations between first himself and his father and then his mother. The upshot was that his father again threatened to kill him, as he had in the past, and his mother, acknowledging her complicity in the molestation all along, blamed her sons for what she perceived to be her greater victimization. "I hate you, I hate you. I wish you had never been born," she said. And it was not the first time she had said that to her boys. The next day, which was Friday, convinced that their parents were going to kill them, rather than allow them to go public with the facts of the molestation, Eric and Lyle Menendez purchased the shotguns for their own protection. They had intended to buy handguns, which would seem to be a more useful weapon for self-defense since it wasn't so obvious, but found out, being amateurs in the firearm game, found out that you could not buy handguns on demand. You'd have to wait 2 weeks. And their fear was such, they didn't think they would be alive in 2 days, let alone 2 weeks. Eric Menendez will describe for you what the next 2 days were like. The increasing terror, the recurrent nightmares, the lack of sleep, but most importantly, and in great detail, he will describe the ominous words and actions of both parents that convinced him that their plan to eliminate their sons was in place. And on Sunday night, it appeared to him that the trap was sprung. By words and deeds, he perceived that his father and mother were about to kill him. And he reacted with pure terror, pure panic. He fired every round in his gun at them. He believed them incapable of dying. Our expert witnesses, one of whom works with the FBI on the analysis of crime scene evidence and the profiling of sociopathic killers, will describe this crime scene as a classic example of the overkill one sees when frightened and powerless people kill those they fear and perceive as all-powerful. The crime scene of abused children who kill their abusers out of fear. Mr. Kuriyama has talked to you about perfect crime. That information comes from L. Jerome Oziel. It will be for you as a jury to decide whether anything about this crime was perfect at all. I am mindful of the fact, however, that the prosecution is relying very heavily in this case on the testimony of L. Jerome Oziel.
Again, seated, Mr. Kuriyama. Let's get to the recitation of what evidence you expect,
I will, Your Honor,
rather than who is relying on what or what you're...
Dr. Oziel, as the prosecution refers to him, to support their theory of why these killings occurred. You are the judges of the credibility of all of the witnesses, and what this means is that the source of any piece of information is as important as the information itself. We will challenge through evidence in this case the accuracy of the information given to you by L. Jerome Oziel in this trial. He was not present when these events occurred, so he can know no more than what he was told. And he was not told the truth about why these killings took place. He can, however, like any other witness, say more than he knows, because like any other witness, he can lie. And we will challenge the truthfulness of L. Jerome Oziel in this trial. We will present evidence to you to prove that this man operates on his own agenda, that he has motives to lie about what he was told by the Menendez brothers, and that he has a track record of lying, manipulating, and controlling people for his own selfish purposes. There are many witnesses who will testify in this trial who bear the title doctor. You will have to weigh their qualifications. Most important, you will have to judge their honesty.